Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Journalist Resource webinar on the impact of manipulation and removal of federal data that's been happening in recent months. I'm Naseem Miller. I'm Senior Health Editor at the Journalist Resource. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a project of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard Kennedy School. And our mission is simply to make it easier for journalists to understand and use academic research throughout every step of their reporting and editing process. Our content is free to republish, and we encourage you to visit our website's Know Your Research section to learn more about reading and understanding academic research. A couple of quick logistical details before we get started. We have a stellar panel of data experts and scientists with us today. We have each of them speak about 5 or 6 minutes to help us understand the significance of what's happening with federal data and why it's important for us as journalists to pay attention to these changes. We'll then open things up to your questions. To enter a question, please go down to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and enter your question. And if you want the question to go to someone in particular in the panel, please include that too. A full video of this briefing should be available on the Shorenstein Center's website by the end of the week. We'll also share the video and a summary of the webinar at the Journalist Resource website. All right, I'm not going to give full introduction to our speakers and let them introduce themselves. Let's save the time for this webinar. We'll also drop a link to the chat to the webinar's registration page where you can see the panelists' full bios. So let's start with you, Allison. If you would, please introduce yourself to our audience. And if you could, please set the stage for our conversation today and let us know why federal data matters.
Sure. Thank you, Naseem. I'm Allison Plyer. I'm the Chief Demographer at the Data Center in New Orleans. I'm also the co-chair of the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force, and I'm the past chair of the U.S. Census Bureau Scientific Advisory Committee. But as the Chief Demographer of the Data Center in New Orleans, I receive dozens and sometimes hundreds of requests and questions about data every year. And these requests really make it clear that federal data is critical infrastructure for media and policymakers and average citizens. It informs so many decisions, and many decision makers assume data exists to answer nearly any question they have. In particular, those who have relied on data in the past are shocked if that data doesn't get updated. They assume they can track progress over time. So this used to be possible with most federal data sets, but may not be true going forward, as my colleagues will explain. But just to give you a few examples of the vast range of federal data uses, disaster response leaders use Census Bureau's annual data from the American Community Survey to determine how many people are affected by a disaster and then to measure recovery in the years afterward. Sites like Zillow use the Department of Education's civil rights data collection to help homebuyers determine which schools have the best disability resources for kids. Self-driving cars rely on NOAA's National Geodetic Survey geographic location and elevation data to stay in their lanes. Imagine if every car company was working with its own data points that didn't perfectly align. And data from the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Information System helps states deploy limited federal funds for improving drinking water quality where it's needed most. And then organizations like Feeding America use data from the USDA's Household Food Security Report to understand where and how people are experiencing food insecurity across the country. But this survey was eliminated 10 days ago, as I think my colleague Denise will talk about. So these data are really critical. We're going to talk about how some of them are disappearing or being degraded. With that in mind, a lot of people are searching for solutions, but many proposals raised just really aren't feasible or have limits. So for private companies, there's no financial motivation to publish comprehensive, publicly available data. For example, among other limitations, ADP payroll data only covers medium and large size businesses that are their own customers, right? So ADP itself says its jobs report is not meant to forecast the Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly jobs report. It's not adequate. Sometimes city and state data on issues like water quality can be useful, but then someone still needs to aggregate it and ensure consistency for national comparability. And it would take considerable budget, capacity, and access for nonprofits to fully replicate federal data functions, and capacity at scales that nonprofits just don't have. And I'll just mention one other thing. Archiving data, of course, is critical, and there's an active and critical archival movement organized by the Data Rescue Project. But as time goes on, archives become less useful for up-to-date research and decision-making. What's most important is that essential federal data sets keep flowing.
Thank you so much for that. And Denise, let's turn to you. And if you could please introduce yourself to our audience. And if you would please share your insight into this growing problem of data manipulation, removal, degradation that's been happening in recent months.
Yeah, thank you, Naseem. So hi, everybody. I'm Denise Ross. I served as the U.S. Chief Data Scientist in the Biden administration, where I led the charge to use detailed, timely data to drive better outcomes for all Americans. The patterns that I'm seeing in the attacks on federal data fall into three main buckets. The first bucket we saw emerge at the end of January, got a lot of coverage when the administration began targeted removals of data that were not aligned with administration priorities. Often this was individual data elements, not necessarily complete data sets. This included data on gender identity, climate, and DEI. For example, gender identity data were removed from the Bureau of Prisons data, and race and ethnicity data were removed from federal employment data. Data about people employed by the federal government. The next bucket is not necessarily targeted at specific data sets, but rather reflects the collateral damage from things like reductions in the federal workforce, cutting of contracts, and termination of scientific advisory committees. The federal government also has just a lot more red tape these days, too. For example, if the Commerce Secretary has to personally sign off on any contract greater than $100,000, that makes it a lot harder for the remaining staff working on getting data collected, secured, and published. It makes it harder for them to secure the technology and contract support that they need. And these damages, the collateral damages to the federal data apparatus, get a little less attention because it's often a death of 1,000 cuts, but it will take years or decades to recover from this collateral damage. And the last bucket are data that reflect poorly on the performance of this administration's policies. And we're seeing more of this recently. In June, for example, the Social Security Administration removed performance data, including information on how long people have to stay on hold when they call the National Call Center. The timing of this coincided with the departure of more than 5,000 Social Security Administration staff, and also increased efforts to put into place anti-fraud measures that might lead to people needing to call the call center because their account got flagged. And then just last week, USDA, as Allison mentioned, announced that they are canceling the Current Population Survey Food Security Supplement. That is the only federal collection that gives us details we need on whether Americans have dependable access to enough safe and healthy food. The timing of this cancellation is also interesting because it happens just as new policies go into place that will kick millions of Americans off the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, also known as food stamps. And then lastly, the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program is on the chopping block. It collects data from 8,000 or so large greenhouse gas emission sources, and its termination coincides with the ongoing weakening of climate regulations. So that's a pattern that we've really started to see kick up this summer. And then I just wanted to mention there's sort of a bonus bucket that we're seeing in terms of the degradation, and that is the declining trust in government and declining survey response rates. This has been going on for a couple of decades. And with the way that this federal government is using data collected about Americans for law enforcement purposes and other sort of off-label purposes, we are getting some anecdotal evidence now that people are increasingly hesitant to fill out their details on government forms. And at the local level, we're also hearing about a chilling effect on people seeking federal services in the first place. So you may see just less data collected through administrative records and surveys than in the past. And that can have a real detrimental effect on super important surveys like the American Community Survey or the decennial census coming up in 2030. So just to wrap all this up, because of these actions, there's really barely a division between data sets that are safe and those that are in danger. I would categorize all federal data sets are at risk to some degree or another, but each of them have different characteristics that make their situation a little unique. Back to you, Nassim.
Thank you so much, Denise. And Erica, if you could, please introduce yourself to the audience, and I'm hoping you can share with us what to watch for going forward.
Sure. So I'm Erica Groshin. I'm Senior Economic Advisor at the Cornell ILR School and the 14th Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I served from 2013 to 2017. My background is I'm a labor economist who spent most of my career actually in the Federal Reserve System, the Cleveland Fed and the New York Fed. So let me talk about what to watch for. Let me start off with in some ways the media sort of thing. You know, what would be the signs of manipulation of data? So if you're worried about manipulation, and some examples that have come up already are where these proposals by the Secretary of Commerce to alter GDP calculations, or then proposals perhaps by the now former nominee for the new BLS commissioner to change how revisions were calculated, things like that. So what would you see? Well, the simplest thing that you might see would be an injection of spin into release narratives. So what you have to think about is that they're producing the monthly releases. I'm going to focus on those for now, from the BLS. Requires a very automated set of procedures. These are computer programs that take the raw data and put out the many hundreds of tables actually that are associated with each of these releases. So it's very hard to change those on the fly. And that means that the easiest thing to change is actually the narrative around that. So you might see injection of spin into release narratives, where usually the language is very dry and just uses very few adjectives and makes no referral to presidential policies, but you might get spin. You might, if they try to actually monkey with the numbers themselves, then you'd probably see delayed releases, because it would be very hard to inject that kind of manipulation into this very finely tuned process. You're throwing a wrench into a machine that would break down in some way or another. So you might see incomplete releases or an increased number or significance of errors as a result of this. You'd see unannounced changes in methodology and formats or other practices. So there's a set of practices that the statistical agencies use to create trust in them, transparency of many different kinds. And that a lot of that is announcing things in advance. We are going to do something. This is why we're doing it. This is when it's going to happen. These are the reasons for it. If you start to get unannounced changes, then you can worry about why this is happening without the usual transparency. Another thing to look for would be staff resistance, and that this would take the form of leaks, quits, whistleblowing, firings, transfers, etc. Because when you're violating the norms within the agency, when you're going against the culture, then you will have people speaking out. In fact, promised by a group of BLS employees, put out a statement saying, if there is monkeying, we will tell you. Right. And so I think you could expect that to happen. And then finally, another sign of intent would be to put a lot of political people into the statistical agencies. Right now, BLS has 0 political appointees. The commissioner is usually the only political appointee there. If the new commissioner were to bring in another group of politicals, then this would be, I think, at least a flashing yellow light. What's the need for politicals when they've never been needed before? Application of schedule policy career would be something else to look out for. This is an intention of this administration to allow the president to change the terms of civil service appointments when the president deems them to be in a policy influencing position. That means that then they would be essentially at these people in those positions could be fired for interfering with the policy positions of the president. So all of those things, I think, are things to look out for and of concern. There are larger long-term concerns about delayed modernization. Those have a lot to do with funding. And those I think are very much a threat to the statistical system. And I guess I'm not expecting the administration to try and push ahead on modernization, but if they do, then modernization in and of itself is a great idea, but you wouldn't want it to be used to disguise what is really intended to be manipulation of some sort.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Denise, I wanted to go back to you and ask a question about data sets. There are some major ones that a lot of us have heard of, but there are also lesser known ones that are important about transparency and accountability. Can you share a little more information about that?
Happy to. There's a lot in the headlines about statistical data like jobs data or weather data that we all use every day. But it's also worth keeping an eye on the types of data that the government collects that shine a light on federal operations themselves. I'll just give a few examples. One is USA spending data that shows federal spending information, including information about federal awards such as contracts, grants, and loans. And it is key for transparency and accountability. And this data set becomes especially high stakes in areas recovering from disasters where the quality of the disaster depends on federal money flowing quickly. Another performance data set is the ones that we see around safety net programs like SNAP, otherwise known as food stamps, and Medicaid. There are mandated reporting from the states that show, for example, how long it takes for different states to process applications or how long call center wait times are. Those are going to be especially important given the changes in eligibility requirements for some of those safety net programs. Another example is operational data from Custom and Border Protection, which shows the uptick of officers conducting searches of travelers' phones and other devices. That information is really useful for people traveling internationally. And then there are also wonkier data sets that people like me spend a lot of time in that provide transparency and opportunities for public engagement around the production of federal data. For example, the Information Collection Request Database out of OMB tracks changes to federal forms and surveys, including changes that I talked about earlier, like the removal of gender or race questions from different surveys. And when these types of data sets disappear, it becomes harder to report on government activities and performance, and it also becomes harder for the public to participate in our democracy.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask each of you briefly if you could share the impact of what's happening with the federal data on journalism and why it's important for journalists to continue covering this. If you have any story ideas, any kind of data sets journalists should go and ask for. So maybe we can start with you, Denise, since you were just mentioning these data sets.
Sure, happy to. So this silver lining for a data geek like me is that there's a lot of talk about federal data these days. And I think this gives an opportunity to talk about how local communities rely on federal data and how people will be harmed when it disappears. Just a few examples. If a football coach uses a weather app to know when to move practice inside because the heat index is too high, he's using federal data. If a farmer is using ag tech that helps them right size the amount of irrigation they use on their crops, they're using federal data. If a startup company is creating AI tools to help first responders, or building autonomous shipping systems, or planning to mine the moon for critical minerals, they're all using in federal data. And so what I've been doing with a group of data nerds is cataloging use cases like these at essentialdata.us. It's a growing collection of short examples of how specific federal data sets benefit everyday Americans and businesses. So please check it out. Hopefully there'll be some story ideas there. And if you'd like us to dig in more specifically to a data set and its potential local implications and users, reach out to us on that website.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Denise was saying, journalists working on a specific topic can really be hampered due to a lack of access to federal data. So, you know, no longer publishing data on billion-dollar disasters makes it hard to quantify the impact of climate change locally. Reports on the impacts of federal staff cuts would be impacted by, as she mentioned, the Office of Personnel Management's removal of the race and ethnicity data from federal workforce. And if this information, when it's erased from public websites, journalists often, you know, don't have anywhere to turn. And even if it's put back up, which has happened, you know, journalists may not know if it's been manipulated or not. But there's a few strategies we've been thinking about that journalists can use when data is removed or incomplete or altered. One is, you know, be sure to talk to an expert who uses the specific data set you're interested in. They will probably know, you know, what's happened, what's changed, what's disappeared. Advocacy groups and can be helpful too. Former federal staff can be helpful in determining the limitations or even finding an alternative to a data set. You know, make a statistician your new best friend. That could be a big help with a number of topics if you're not finding the data you need. Some data is actually gathered at the local level and then fed to the federal government. So health data, education data, crime data. So you could find it individually. And then if you needed a national comparison, you know, aggregate it yourself or maybe alongside an advocacy group, as that's a pretty big lift. There's also public comments in the Federal Register that you could continue to monitor for better policy and legal understanding of what's going on. We're working alongside with our partners who are doing key work around data preservation and monitoring to build out a list of knowledgeable experts who can help inform your understanding as you cover specific issues. So we'll be working to make that list available, whether they might be experts in climate or experts in health, et cetera, and that can be helpful to journalists working on specific topics.
Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, so I think that there's some important lessons here for journalists. Let me start off by saying something very clearly about BLS. There is no evidence of any manipulation of the data so far. So far, the data are good. All right. It is the gold standard. That doesn't mean that it's perfect, because all statistics have limitations. They are inherently imperfect. So it is the job of the statistical agencies to be transparent about those limitations so that users know what the data are, what are good and appropriate uses of the data and what are not. So keeping that in mind is important, because these days a lot of these limitations are being weaponized in a way that's unwarranted, right? And so the limitations of the data and the need to modernize is somehow being held against the agencies when they are the very ones who are transparent about those limitations and about their desire to modernize. So don't fall for that kind of a trap. I would say keep in touch with the ASA and the various friends group, like the Friends of BLS, like APDU, COPAFS, COSA. There's, you know, it's this long list of groups that are, you know, represented here and kind of work in concert with the statistical community to help you understand these things and perhaps explain things in ways that the statistical agencies can't. So keep in touch, particularly with the Friends of BLS. Ask us what's going on. And then I would say cite your sources, explain why it is that you trust the data, and encourage. Here's a very important thing for statistical agencies to do. Make sure that you encourage participation in the federal surveys. Take a story about why it is that people should trust that their data is safe, I think is very important, both to help keep it safe and to promote the quality of the data. If you need to find sources, here's some advice for you. These groups that I just mentioned of people who are associated with the statistical system often have contacts that might be useful to you for particular questions. So reaching out to the Census Project or groups like Abdu, COPAS, etc., can be a way to find a source that can help you answer a question. And you can also find sources with deep expertise on particular projects by looking at the comments in the Federal Register notices, because those are experts that are commenting on particular problems. The Data Index US has a newsletter where they share proposed changes to federal statistical data sets, also with opportunities for public comments. The last thing that I should mention is that I was just talking to Jed Kolko yesterday, and he is trying to come up with we'll see how far he gets, but he's planning to try and convene a group of people who will do a rapid response look at any data release. Well, not a number of the main data releases, particularly BLS ones, and just make sure that they see nothing fishy in any of them. So there are all of these efforts out there. So for what you're doing, I think you want to make sure that you are not prey to weaponization of standard features of statistical programs and the need to modernize that is now being used to attack the trustworthiness of the data. And then also have the resources on hand to follow up when you have questions. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And before we turn to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you all about something very timely and this impact of the current shutdown on federal data. Erica, do you want to start us with that?
Sure. So I happen to have been commissioner during the last shutdown of BLS. So what is it like there right now? It's actually worse than when I was there, because when I was there, there were 3 of us. And now apparently what's going to happen is that there will be just one person, Bill Wyatrowski, there. No releases will be made during this time. No data will be collected. The website will not be updated. If you try to call the commissioner's office, either no one will answer the phone or Bill Wyatrowski will pick it up himself. He may not talk to you, but that's what's going to be happening. Now, the impact of the shutdown on the data itself is very dependent on which program you're looking at, because each program has a different strategy for collecting data. It collects from different, does it do households? Does it do firms? Does it collect information just during one particular week, or is it ongoing throughout the month? So the duration of the shutdown, the timing in the monthly cycle matters, what particular program you're looking at matters a lot. But if you want to get an idea of what the likely impact is going to be, you can look at the impact of the 2013 shutdown program by program on the BLS website. And that will help you find out. So for example, I think there's, you've been given a link about, that goes, a couple of links that go into what was the impact on the employment situation of the 16-day shutdown in 2013. And that goes through a lot of gory detail on the impact. Then there's also, there's a link to how all of the BLS programs were affected by that 16-day shutdown in terms of what happened to the timing of the releases. So that I think can be a good guide to you going forward on what it is, how it is that the programs are going to be affected. In general, the employment situation will affect the timing of the release, but not the quality of the data unless the shutdown runs into the collection period for those data. For the CPI, that data is collected continually over the course of the month. And so it's much more likely to affect part of the data collection. So that's something to watch out for. And that's true of all of the price programs. So it depends on the program you're looking at, but this is, it will have an effect. The other thing to realize is because BLS staffing is down by at least 20% and about a third of the leadership positions at BLS are vacant, then when BLS comes back, it won't have the person power in place to recover in the way that it did in 2013, and that could likely have an effect as well.
Allison?
Sure. In regard to the Census Bureau, the Census Bureau put out a shutdown plan, which includes maintaining needed IT resources to ensure the safety and security of their data. We haven't talked about the Census Bureau's privacy protections yet, but that could be a whole additional topic because the Census Bureau has the strongest privacy protections of any federal agency, and their data has not been breached by DOJ or other actors. So it doesn't surprise me that they consider maintaining the safety and security of their data to be mission critical. The Census Bureau also will use carryover balances to continue the activities preparing for the 2026 census test, which is critical to the 2030 census. They state in their shutdown plan, it is mission critical priority for ensuring the 2030 census operational viability. All of which is to say that each decennial census takes almost more than a decade really to plan, and the 2026 tests are really critical. So they are prioritizing that. But other 2030 census planning activities are stopping, and the American Community Survey data collection will stop. So for that critical survey, that's going to reduce the sample size, which results in less reliable data. So for how folks might think about this, we all are aware of how polling data has become less reliable. Well, if the American Community Survey has a smaller sample due to a government shutdown of more than just a few days, we'll have less reliable data. And that's the survey that generates all kinds of demographic information, poverty rates, homeownership rates, et cetera, on an annual basis, and informs so many business and government decisions. So that data being less reliable is concerning.
Denise?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Erica and Allison said. The shutdown will also accelerate that collateral damage to the federal data apparatus. And you could imagine, for example, if you have data that's collected through monitors that measure river flood stages or air quality monitors or dangerous weather patterns, there may not be anybody to fix that hardware when it breaks. And so the degradation of the collection mechanisms goes beyond the surveys that Erica and Allison were talking about, but also to the physical monitoring equipment as well. And we can imagine just across the board that data products may be further delayed, and perhaps less timely and relevant. And it's worth noting that in data.gov, there are some 300,000 federal data sets. So there's a vast number of data sets that stand to be impacted by the shutdown.
Thank you. And I wanted to, Erica, go back, and you mentioned this somewhat, but a specific question from audience as we start answering them. One is, what will happen with the anticipated revisions to BLS data if the shutdown continues, or if the new BLS commissioner just decides to suppress them? And along with that, somebody else mentions that there is no evidence of manipulation of BLS data, but it seems odd that when the new commissioner came in, they immediately issued a report revising the job numbers from 24th and 25th. I know BLS constantly revises their numbers, but is it really above board?
Okay, so those are really good questions. So let me start off. What'll happen to the anticipated revisions if the shutdown continues? Well, it really depends on how specifically how long the shutdown lasts, and I think that's the main thing. So the shutdown is happening after the collection for the September for the report on September 2025, right? And so when that employment situation is eventually published, I don't think you will see any impact of the shutdown on those numbers, because they will already have been collected. So the only thing that's going to happen after that is it's just the publication of the tables and the release. Now for October, you won't, unless the shutdown continues into the third, fourth week of October, then again, you're not going to see any impact on the revisions as a result of that. But if it goes into October, extends for a month, or more than 3 weeks, that's when the collection period is likely to be affected, and then you might get bigger. Ironically, you could even get smaller revisions, because you'd be further, the payroll survey, you'd be further, companies would know more by the time they were asked for the information. So that could be better. But for the household survey, you'd have a longer recall rate for the reference week. And so there you might get more imprecision as a result of it. No evidence. Okay, the question about manipulation of the data. So this is really important to understand. There is no new commissioner at BLS. Since Erica McIntyre was fired, there has been an acting deputy commissioner, the deputy commissioner, whom I appointed, who is a BLS lifer, is the acting commissioner at BLS. So nothing in the processes has changed since Erica McIntyre was fired. The commissioner has no role in the production of the release, except for maybe suggesting edits to the narrative. All the data are final by the time the commissioner looks at it, and everybody else there is a civil service employee who is well inculcated to the culture of the agency. So it is only a coincidence that the firing of the BLS commissioner happened right before the annual benchmarking revision. That annual benchmarking revision was higher than average, but within norms for the for annual revisions. And that's it happens sometimes, and that really is truly a coincidence. So it's all of this, was following the normal procedures. It's above board. That's not the thing to be worried about. There are things to be worried about going forward if you actually politicize the agency, but that's not what happened then.
Great. And another follow-up question on BLS is that though BLS and other data might not now be compromised and might never be moving forward, the current situation may have already created perceptions of manipulation and further general erosion. Might this have any effect inside BLS, for example, and with how estimates are communicated to the public?
Mhm. Well, erosion of trust is a really serious damage to the BLS. So let me start off by addressing that. It damages the BLS and really the country in two ways, because it damages the ability of BLS to serve the country. And remember, these data are intended to help people make good decisions. That's the whole purpose of them. And so if erosion of trust means fewer people use the data, then they're probably going to use a worse source or none at all, and the decisions they make will be worse. So that interferes with the mission of the agency. The other reason erosion of trust is really bad is because, remember, BLS is very dependent on survey responses. And people don't, it's a perfectly reasonable thing for someone who loses trust in BLS's data to say, well, then why should I bother responding to this survey? So you could expect that survey response rates would decline even further, and that would be a threat to all of us who depend on that information. So, so those are, that's why erosion of trust is really so damaging. And there is an entire set of principles and practices for a federal statistical agency that is put out by the Committee on National Statistics that goes through how it is you build that trust up. And there's a directive from OMB that governs the statistical agencies called the Trust Directive. That is all about the practices that agencies need to follow to uphold that trust. And if that directive ceases to be followed or is altered to reduce the set of practices that uphold trust, then this is something I would worry about. Right now, that's not what's going on. But you started off with something else that I'm not sure I got to.
I think you got it all.
Oh,
So,
okay.
Yeah. Let's move to the next question, and it's about barriers. They're asking if we are seeing any increased barriers to information sharing between government agency, between different federal agency, or between federal, state, and local government.
Yeah, I can answer that one. I think you might be referring to the information silos executive order that was issued this spring. And what it did is it required agencies to gain quote unquote unfettered access to data collected by state governments or third-party providers for state governments as they deliver on federal programming. And it also breaks down the privacy protections for historical privacy protections between agencies for data sharing. And so if anything, we're seeing fewer of those safeguards being enacted for data sharing between agencies. And I think that really goes into the next question, Naseem. Can everybody see the questions, or would it be helpful
Go ahead.
if we yes, so the next question was to address concerns about all the data collected by Musk and company, including everyone's social security records, tax records, health records, and info on who is and is not receiving government benefits. Is it too late to protect accidental use of these data in ways that are clearly illegal and violate federal privacy laws? And getting back to Erica's point about trust, like trust is absolutely fundamental for the entire federal apparatus, and even with the formal statistical agencies having trust guidelines in place, the larger distrust of how data are being used or misused by federal agencies is it's going to have a negative effect on people's willingness to give information to the federal government and their willingness to trust the data that's coming out of the federal government. So if you're up for it, Naseem, I think that question about the declining privacy protections and the misuse of federal data is a great topic for another webinar. And there's like some really incredible experts in that field who could speak in more detail to that issue.
Thank you.
Just-
Another question. Go ahead.
I just want to add that as far as I know, Musk and company did not try to breach the confidentiality of the data held by any of the big statistical agencies. So not at BLS and not at Census. They've been doing, they collected data from lots of other parts of the government, but they did not even try to get into the data held by the statistical agencies. And that's partly because those protections are much more enshrined in practices and in law than in some of the other parts of the government. So that's, a small silver lining to all of this.
We have another question about accountability. What role do you see for government accountability organization, inspectors generals, auditors, related to data transparency and maintaining and finding alternatives to federal data?
I can speak to that briefly, just that the best outcome for all of us is that these data keep flowing. So the degree that the government accountability organizations can press for that, that would be the best outcome. And especially data that are already statutorily required, for example, on performance of the public safety net programs, making sure that when data disappear, that they don't disappear quietly.
And I will say also that we have a distributed statistical system. We don't have a central US stats. And so to the extent that they operate under the same rules, those are run by OMB. The Office of Management and Budget has an office there that coordinates amongst the statistical agencies. And there is a chief statistician of the US who resides at OMB, who issues directives to all of the statistical agencies that help to do things like, and I talked about the trust directive, that's from OMB. And the only mechanism for enforcing those directives actually is in the inspector generals, who are charged with enforcing many of these things. This administration has fired all of the inspector generals and has now announced that they are eliminating SIGI, the Council of Inspector Generals, across the government, which coordinates the work of the inspector generals on things that are done across all of the agencies, like enforcing the statistical trust directive. So this is, ironically, this organization, this government agency that I'd never heard of before, turns out eliminating that eliminates the people that were enforcing the trust directive in the federal government, and so is a threat to our statistical system as well. And because it's now being eliminated, no longer there.
A couple of questions here regarding education data. One is somebody's interested in education data and the national report card. How can we track integrity of this data set? And also somebody's asking what key education department IES data are at risk of removal, degradation, or manipulation? You guys have any insight into that?
I can take a stab at it. As Allison mentioned earlier, some federal data collections are what we call third-party collections. So the data originate in some state or local government office, and that certainly is the case with education data. It's reported up from the school districts. So that would be a good way to sort of logic check the data coming out of ed, is to look at the state or district level data in comparison. In terms of the risks to specific data sets and the relative risks to those data sets, at dataindex.us, we have been working with some of the best data thinkers in the federal space to identify what are the factors that constitute risk for a data set. Like, is it a statutory requirement? Is the office adequately staffed? Has the office lost contracts? Is the data set going to be politically inconvenient for the administration policies and whatnot? And we're getting ready to roll out that data index. That risk index at dataindex.us. So please sign up for the newsletter there, and you can be the first to know when that comes out. But the bottom line is that all federal data are at risk to some degree, especially just because of the collateral damage effect that's happening.
Great. I guess, and this question has come up before, and we wonder what could make up for what we might be losing at the federal level. So question is, to what extent can civil society organization, nonprofit organization help in checking accuracy of the data sets and step in for data that is stopped being collected? Can they make up for it, or what's their role? If you could share that, yeah.
I can say a few things, and I'm sure Denise and Erica can as well. I think that there's some things that nonprofits can do, or the civil society. Certainly experts who pay attention to certain data sets all the time because it's part of their research are excellent watchdogs. And they will know if something has changed dramatically with a data set. And so groups like the American Statistical Association are reaching out to experts to say, hey, to ask them, can you volunteer to let us know what's happening with the data set that you're an expert in? So that's certainly important. A nonprofit could potentially take on a certain small scale duplication of some federal data, but really the nonprofit sector just doesn't have the scale that the federal government does. When you look at all the philanthropic assets in the country that support nonprofit work, it's a fraction of the federal budget. So there's just a nonprofit wouldn't be able to do that sustainably. And there would be some danger, even if one did do it in the short term, that could be an excuse then for the federal government to say, oh, we don't need to do this, right? And becomes a burden and a hardship on civil society to keep it up. But Denise and Erica may have additional observations there.
Well, I think there's another angle on this that I think is important, which is that this is an important piece of our national infrastructure, right? This, in the information age, our federal statistical system is as important infrastructure as roads and bridges and everything else like that. So what we're talking about is a failure of our elected officials, and therefore the people who fund these elected officials, right, to be responsive to this need for good information. So so I think a set of stories could be written about, let's look at the legislative agenda of some of our major business organizations, financial sector, other sort, and say, do they have in there support for the federal statistical system? And if not, why not? It's not a lot of money, but they really depend on it. So why aren't they supporting the modernization of the federal statistical system in the way that it should be supported, and supporting the laws and the regulations that are necessary for the data to be trustworthy? And that, I think, is a real, dog that isn't barking that should be. And so I think challenging that that world to do to explain what they are doing to support the statistical system, including participating in surveys, because when we talk about the response rates falling to BLS surveys, we're talking about businesses no longer responding to the surveys. Why? Are they responding? BLS can't tell you whether or not a particular business can respond, but the businesses can respond. So maybe some journalist needs to go around and start asking companies, are you responding? And if so, if not, why not? And if yes, why?
So as we are getting close to the end of the webinar, I wanted to ask you guys a question about the role of journalists and watchdogs. How can we effectively verify, expose, and counteract data suppression or distortion, especially when some political actors are also weaponized mass media, party networks, and coordinated cyber campaigns to discredit both the press and the original data itself? So it's a complicated question from one of the audience members. But again, what is your advice for journalists on exposing and also sounding the alarm for the public? What story ideas do you have? What stories are not being covered? And then maybe we can start with you, Erica.
Okay, so it is a delicate balance. I mean, you don't want to reinforce unwarranted attacks, right? That does as much damage as ignoring actual attacks. So it's going to be very, very important to not fall prey to unwarranted attacks, wherever they come from, but yet to be to be rightly skeptical. So I think one of the key things here is to find experts that you are comfortable with, that you can go to, and that whether they are academics or former statistical agencies employees, it's or any of these groups that we've talked about that are trying to follow up. So don't I think that that's very important. And then trying to get beyond the immediate moment and look at the big picture is really important here, to understand the context that we have. Our statistical system has evolved over time. It has responsibilities to continue to evolve, and putting instead of falling prey to allegations of manipulation where there isn't manipulation, you have to have grounds for judging whether or not these stories actually make sense, because the people who are trying to misinform you are relying on you not having enough background to be able to judge that their stories are just wrong. So if you get assigned to something and you don't understand the context, then try and reach out to people who will have the context, because otherwise you can be misled.
Allison?
I have a quick addition. Sorry. I would encourage journalists to be intentional about seeking out diverse data experts, and especially those from the local community who represent a variety of lived experiences, who can tell the story about why data matter to a specific community. So go beyond sort of the usual suspects for your data experts and look at people who reflect the demographic diversity of the United States.
And I would just quickly add to that, When you see the data is removed because the administration doesn't want that measurement of their progress, so whether it's jobs data or food insecurity, gather anecdotes about people who are affected by loss of jobs, food insecurity. Qualitative data can be really powerful in the absence of quantitative data, and pairing the absence of the quantitative with the qualitative can make a strong story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So much great timely information and so many great story ideas here. Thanks to all of you who attended, and thanks for those of you who are journalists and covering this important issue and paying attention. And with that, we'll all see you guys at our next webinar. And thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.